So first things first, in order to use YAML in Symfony, now in this example we're using it in our project instead of in Drupal 8 directly, we need to include the YAML component, and that's going to be something that we pull in through our composer.json file. So let's jump to our resource pack directory. So let's compare the step 2 composer.json adding YAML component.step to our composer.json file in our Symfony 2 folder. I'm going to drag this over to my file comparison tool. Then I'll drag the other file over too. And so on our left, we have our original file, and on our right, we have the updated file. And you can see that we've added 2 lines, one for the YAML component, and then the other for the config component. Now, Drupal 8 doesn't use the config component. It basically recreated certain parts of the config component to make it more performant. So we don't need that in Drupal 8. You're not going to see it in the composer.json file in the Drupal 8 base directory. But in order to use YAML in this context where we don't have Drupal 8 as well, we're going to need the config component too. The other change that you might have noticed here is that we're going from version 2.1 of these various components over to version 2.4. The reason why we're doing this is because in Drupal 8 it uses the 2.4 component. Now if you remember from our discussion about semantic versioning earlier, the 0.4 is a minor release, so it means that there should be backwards compatibility. So all of the examples that we've done so far should work just fine in 2.4. However, there are some things that you can build in 2.4 or some features that you can use in it that won't be available in 2.1. All right, so let's open these up in our editor. And I'm going to copy the code from our composer.json adding YAML component.step over the code that's in the current composer.json file and save it. And now we'll need to run composer update. So I'll jump back to the command line, and we should be in the right folder, and I'm going to type in composer.var update. All right, it looks like everything is good to go. So now before we start applying YAML to the various parts of our application where it would be useful, let's look at what we have now. I'm going to jump back to our folder, and let's expand out our source folder so we can see everything that's in there. This should look familiar from the previous videos. Now, the point of YAML is to replace areas where we're establishing configuration using an array of some kind. So there are 2 places in our code where it would make sense to switch over to this format. The first is with our routes, which we can find in our app.php file. So let me open this up. Now we only have 1 route in our routes at this point, but as we increase complexity in our application, we would end up seeing this routes add many times. Now what we're doing here by adding a route is basically setting up a set of configuration. We're saying what the key is for this route. We're saying what the path is for this route. We're setting a default for the variables that might get used in the context of this route. In this case, it's just a year that would normally get passed in through the URL. And then we're also setting the controller for this route. All this is static information about this route, and if you can imagine going through iterations of this code and trying to boil it down to its very basic parts, you'd end up with something like a simple array. If you've gone through the PHP Programming Basics collection, then you've seen how this works in practice. Once we've isolated out the information into a simple array, then we can add some logic to loop through that array and apply whatever is needed to it. So the idea of YAML is that we're going to basically isolate out the important parts of this code into an array, but instead of creating it as a PHP array, what we're going to use this neutral file structure called a YAML file to store that data. Now, Symfony comes with a general YAML parser, which will take a YAML file and convert it into a PHP array, but then there are additional YAML parsers that add some additional processing on top of that, so that we can have YAML files that have a specific expected structure. When it has that expected structure, then that class that does the parsing can provide more custom errors that will help you track down what might be wrong with the structure of your file. Let's convert the routes in this app.php over to a YAML file. So if we go back to our resource pack directory, we can open up this 3rd step called routes.yaml, converting routes to a YAML format. And you can see here how we're isolating out the core of what was happening with our route add into an array. We can compare this to the app.php file. So here we have a unique name for our route, and in our YAML file, We use this as the top level of the array. And then from here down, we have a set of keys, like path and defaults, and then values for them. So path is what we were passing here into new routing route, and then the defaults include whatever it is that we were going to be passing into routing route as the second parameter. In this case, it would be the year and also the controller. If you think of the YAML file as an array, each indentation is another level inside of the array. So all of these elements here belong inside of leap year. And you can see here that this is actually just one line that's carrying over to the next line. So there's just two keys here and two values. Now we'll go over the specifics of the YAML syntax in just a minute, but hopefully you can see the clear advantages of using this type of structure. Over here in routes add, we had to do a lot of extra code. We had to set up a new object here, we had to run routes add, and you can see that we had multiple levels of parentheses, which can make it easy to make a mistake, and it just seems a little bit inefficient. Over here in our YAML file though, we've taken out everything that would be duplicated between these multiple routes add calls, and it's also a bit easier to read.